Thank you all for coming. It's great to have a full house in this space. And yeah, very excited to be able to introduce the speakers for tonight's discussion. I'm Arthur Oh. I'm a faculty in the photography program here at Parsons School of Design. And this is an ongoing collaboration with the Aperture Foundation. This series is called Confounding Expectations. It's a series of panel discussions on contemporary issues in photography. There's also a companion series, which are artist lectures that happen at the Aperture Foundation in Chelsea. And we have two more events upcoming in this semester. One happens on October 13th by Dana Lichtenberg in conversation with our another colleague here in the photography program, George Pitts, and another event on December 1st by Bill Jacobson. So, if you can make it to those things, that would be great. And you can find out more information about these programs on aperture.org. So again, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce tonight's speakers. Charlotte Cotton is an author and editor who has been at the forefront of the appraisal of contemporary art photography for over 20 years. She has held curatorial positions at institutions including the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Photographers Gallery in London, and the Wallace Annenberg Department of Photography at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She has been a visiting scholar and critic at institutions including here at Parsons and NYU, SVA, California College of the Arts in San Francisco, Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles, Yale School of Art, and I just spoke to Charlotte and she said that I could announce this. So she's also the upcoming, or she's the new executive director for programming at the International Center for Photography, so which is great. Leslie Hewitt studied at Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art and Yale School of Art and NYU, where she was a Clark Fellow in the Africana and Visual Culture Studies programs. She was included in the 2008 Whitney Biennial and was the recipient of the 2008 Art Matters Research Grant to the Netherlands. Her work has been included in recent and forthcoming exhibitions at venues including the Museum of Modern Art, Studio Museum in Harlem, and Artist Space, Project Row Houses in Houston, and LAX Art in Los Angeles. Hewitt has held residencies at the Studio Museum in Harlem, Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University, and the American Academy in Berlin, among others. She has recently joined the faculty of Barnard College in the Department of Art History. Kate Steciw holds a BA from Smith College and an MFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Steciw has exhibited her art extensively in New York, most recently in group exhibitions at the International Center of Photography, Hauser and Wirth, Johannes Vo Gallery, and I-Beam. She has had recent solo exhibitions at the Neumeister Bar M in Berlin, the Anna Rama Gallery in Naples, Italy, the Levi Delville Gallery in Brussels. Her work has been featured in Art Forum, Art in America, and Interview magazine. Kate lives and works in Brooklyn. And our last but not least speaker is Letha Wilson, who was raised in Colorado and received her BFA from Syracuse University and her MFA from Hunter College in New York. Letha attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2009, and her work has been shown at various venues, including Art in General, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, the Bemis Art Center in, where is the Bemis Art Center? Omaha. The ICP and the Essel Museum of Contemporary Art as well. Wilson's work has been reviewed in Art Forum, Art in America, New York Times, and the New Yorker, among many others. She was recently awarded the NIFA Foundation Fellowship in Photography and also chosen to be a Deutsche Bank Fellow. She also received a Jerome Foundation travel grant in 2014. Letha also lives and works in Brooklyn. So please help me in welcoming our speakers for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur. Arthur is also part of the Magic Inner Circle, as is, and I just spotted the amazing Hannah Whitaker in the audience as well. Is there any more participating Photography is Magic artists here? Well, thank you, and can you give a round of applause to Arthur and to Hannah as well? I am thrilled to be sitting with you. For so many reasons. I'm a great admirer of your works individually, but I'm really excited about having a conversation with three artists of real caliber and real thought. Before we do that, I just want to tell you about what we're going to do today, which is there's not enough time, as there always isn't, it never is with an event. So what we're going to do is we're going to go straight into a conversation, somewhat sort of prepared ideas that we've been thinking about and exchanging, which really get to the heart of Photography is Magic. And then we want to leave quite a long time for discussion and observations coming from you, maybe half an hour. And to supplement that, we have the marvelous Max from Aperture, who is going to be tweeting from my Twitter account while I can't see him the whole way through, but then also gathering some questions from the Twitter sphere for us to add into our questions. So really my sort of first starter question for you guys is this, which is one of the claims that, I mean, it's not a claim, it's actually true, is one of the facts that Photography is Magic deals with is this idea that this incredibly exciting moment within artistic photographic practice, set within the climate of our incredible image environment at large, is artist-led. So there isn't a single institution or cluster of institutions, definitely not the market, that is defining this particular moment. And one of the reasons that it's so attractive to me is, you know, I'm quite old, and my training comes out of really that sort of first generation, the sort of the framework set by the first generation of people defining photography as a cultural subject, which was in the 1970s. So I joined institutions and departments which were essentially founded around 1970. And one of the lovelinesses of being in this kind of, essentially the sort of the ripple of the first wave of assessment of photography as a cultural subject, was that it was incredibly open for people to come from different directions to this place that was being defined, called photography. And that was definitely still, even in the 90s, was very much part of my training ground. And what I love about this moment is that we're kind of in the similar sort of situation. Admittedly, photography as a cultural subject has maybe been overly defined, but that the image environment in which you as artists are operating has not. And we do need to come from many directions to make that new cultural definition of what it means to create in our current environment. So my starter question for you is really, where do you come from? How did you get to this place right now? Well, anyone who picks up on my
I picked up first. Yeah, I always think about this in relation to my practice because it was such a peculiar time that I came into studying photography. I didn't study photography in undergrad, but I did for graduate school, which was the years between 2000 and 2002, which was we still had wet dark rooms. We were working entirely in wet dark rooms, and we had little access to Photoshop, and in fact most of that access was in classes like web design and sort of exterior from photography department classes and slide libraries and all of that. But we did experience 9/11 via the internet. So there was this like confluence of perspectives, and I remember sitting in this web design class, and we're all watching this tragedy unfold, and we're supposed to be paying attention. It was like the first moment where the digital sort of superseded the analog experience of any image-based, cultural event. And so it was really difficult to kind of actively bridge that gap. And after school, I had learned a fair amount of Photoshop, so found my way into fashion and portrait retouching, with a bunch of other kids from similar situations, at Cooper or Parsons or whatever, or New School. And, we were underpaid and overworked and working long hours. And we started to, we were working on other people's images, which was new, to not be performing labor on my own images and all of a sudden be in this digital situation where I'm performing this, creative but authorless labor on someone else's image. Was really interesting, and inevitably started to mess around with other people's images and add things in, switch heads, make secret little messages to each other, and we were sending them back via chat, which is also something I hadn't used until then.
Yeah.
Is this office being very like high tech and all this stuff, which seems really, really lively and really, and the exchanges were really fast. There was no level of expertise or anything, but in the meantime, what our actual output were exhibition prints and fashion stories for the top magazines and all of that stuff. So there's this like underlayer of all of this play that was happening that I became really interested in. And meanwhile, for financial reasons and for psychological reasons, I'd completely stopped taking my own pictures.
Right.
And so I thought, there's something here. There's something to this work performed on these images that maybe there's creative agency here that has to be explored, which sort of led me to working with stock images and Photoshop really heavily in the work.
What did it mean in 2000 to 2002 to be doing an MFA in photography? Like, I mean, was like your dream of what that meant quite different from the reality, given the timing in relation to...
I have some grad school friends that laugh with me.
Okay.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I think it was, I think you guys would agree that it was like a really, a lot of photography that was being celebrated then felt very inaccessible by way of its, just by way of its production, wanting to learn how to light something and failing miserable. I mean, I can't even load my 4x5 film without like half of it being backwards, and just the frustration of that was so profound, and also just feeling like that what was being shown and what was being discussed was so far from what we were able to produce in any way.
Yeah.
But I think that disconnect produced a lot of what all of us are working on now in some form or another.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
That's great. Letha, Leslie.
Okay. Well, I have a very interesting relationship to photography because I don't consider myself a photographer, and I did not study photography. I studied sculpture, but I did apprentice with photographers. So I think my pedagogical connection to photography was through practice, not through the educational superstructure of an art school. And through that process, I realized some of the core issues that draw me to photography, which have to do with memory, have to do with touch, which I think is definitely a latter 20th century phenomena.
Yeah.
And it's probably also in all of our works in varying degrees. And perhaps my interest in photography through the haptic has to do with my connection to sculpture and wanting a material connection to happen with something that was leaving us, that was becoming fleeting, that was continuingly more and more and more virtual. So
was it like when you were apprenticing, was that like learning a sort of passing craft or historical craft? What was it like?
It was, I guess I could say their names. I worked with Andrea Robbins and Max Becker.
Ah.
And a lot of their work is research-based too, and
Yeah.
travel. And I think seeing their bodies interact in spaces as like identifying as photographers, that phenomenon was extremely fascinating to me. The ethics of it seemed to be something that was early 20th century in a way. Like
Yeah.
I felt like an observer, even though I was there for a particular reason. I also felt like I learned a great deal about some of the ethical concerns that I think even were just mentioned about who owns what, who owns an image. I mean, these are embedded in engaging with photography. Authorship is a part of it, and how I think we all, I mean, it's kind of odd to speak for everyone, but I guess how I problematize that is I try to make more layers in my work where the authorship is somehow blurred. And I think working with them in a much more traditional fashion kind of heightened some of those ethical concerns, even though my work looks very different than their works. But just being in that space kind of allowed for me to think about photography, the photographic act, in a different way.
Yeah, and as you say, to think about that act as something not that you're signing up to a lifelong of only expressing your voice through this medium, but actually in quite a detached way, looking at the idea of the photographic. That's great. Letha.
Yeah, I was a painting major, so but when I was at Syracuse, being a painting major, we could kind of basically do whatever we wanted to do, and it under the auspices of being art. So I was really into sculpture and this and that. So I took lots of classes. I took a black and white photo class and a color photo. I learned how to print in the darkroom, but also welding and sculpture. So they were all just tools I used, and I was always kind of carrying around these photographs from. I grew up in Colorado, so these landscape photographs and these like family trips and stuff, they were always just like, after I moved to New York and basically have been in the East Coast ever since I was 18. So somehow trying to sort of wrestle with these images from Colorado and that disconnect between places. So even though I was maybe making sculpture in the studio or actually then making kind of architectural spaces or really interested in that, I would always maybe photograph it or return to this image and then kind of simultaneously working on them, but in grad school finally like merging them, but being really interested in why not? What is it about, and also being aware of all these rules about photography that I just was like, why can't it be bent or folded or whatever and punched through the face and all these things? And it just, to me, that was exciting to think about, even though it took me many years of like working on it to, still working on it.
I mean, that's interesting about where you think, because you're all coming at your photographic practice at what might seem like an oblique angle. So definitely not a classical angle, which I love and adore, and I think that's part of the spirit of this moment. But I wonder, how would you describe your kind of who gives you permission to do this kind of thing? Like along the way, in this period where the jury is really out about whether you should be making, deadpan landscapes with grey skies laminated behind plexi, or empty car parks at night, or photographing yourself naked. Like all of those kind of strategies clearly are not the ones that are really gripping you. So where do you get the permission for the things that you've been doing?
I am struck by your word choice, permission. And I think, as I'm sure the room is filled with many artists, like that's something that's an internal spirit, right?
Yeah.
Like the creative spirit is something that anyone who goes to art school, if you go to fulfill someone else's desire, you will forever be like an assistant or making someone else's work, right? So it's like you have to, at a certain point, galvanize that impulse. And it's hard too. I mean, I'm saying that as someone who was making photographs in a sculpture program, and everyone was like, "What are you doing? Why aren't you making objects?" And it's like you have to push through, because I felt like I needed to be honest to my time, and I was interested in something. I didn't know what it was yet, but I had to realize it first. Right. And praise was not a part of that.
Right.
Right? So this exterior affirmation did not come when you're, in that moment.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting when you say permission, it's like that's kind of a very particular word choice that I'm having trouble grappling with, and I don't know how you feel,
Yeah.
but
I feel like it was a permission I gave myself to use that structure, just because, and externally it felt more like an obligation to, reconcile myself with the work that you just described and the sort of pre-existing like dearth of that. And then also just the onslaught of the rest of image culture as it evolved, with Instagram and Facebook and, earlier iterations of those types of things. It was sort of like, well, now what? Something has to be done, and it felt like anything could be done. So
Yeah.
Yeah, but also sort of why not? And then, do whatever you.
Yeah.
I don't know. I felt like the freedom. Maybe also, I'm not sure if it's because I was not a photo student or didn't know these things that I like had no problem destroying these things or whatever. But I had to kind of. I still had to work hard to get to that place. But I was interested in what that could mean. But it also was like a process of you sort of looking, going to your studio, working on things and building it from there. And then the logic is there. And then like no one asks why. It's like then the proof is in the pudding or something. It's like.
Totally. And I mean, one of the phrases that, Letha, I know that you resonated with you within the text of Photography is Magic, is this idea of thinking of the muscle memory of the magician and the muscle memory of the artist as being something where you can practically naturalize anything, essentially, whether it's analog or digital, seemingly breaking all the rules of a technology, but all of these things can be naturalized, and that naturalization isn't the magic itself, but it's the mechanics that make something truly magic happen. And I suppose, and it's also a sort of that idea of the muscle memory as a convenient way of getting away from the idea that the kind of work that you're doing isn't valid because it doesn't readily demonstrate traditional dexterity and craft-based understandings of fine art photography, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if the purpose is for you making images is not in order to get what someone else might be, for example, in the darkroom.
Right.
Trying to get a perfect print. And I was just there today. But
how did it go?
It was great. But I go there and I'm trying to, I'm wanting images. I'm like, start like being in the desert wanting water. I'm just trying to get things in the world printed quickly. Right. And so I know what I'm doing, and I've been doing it. I go there regularly, but it's sort of my, the mistakes and the things that would make it rubbish for other people then give me other ideas. Or maybe it's fine because I'm going to be crumbling it later. It doesn't matter that there's a little dust of speck on it or whatever. And so my reasons for like success there are different. But also the experience of being there is like you're saying, this muscle memory and this sort of physical act of, relating to that image from conception, the photograph I took and bringing it there and that kind of, maybe that's, I don't know if it's romantic, but that was just sort of how I'm able, for me, it made it less precious. Makes the image less precious because I made it, so I can screw it up. I can destroy it.
I definitely relate to what you're saying in like an opposite way because I didn't make it. I feel totally free to mess it up and alter it, as I see fit. And also, I think too that muscle memory. I find myself making a very similar gesture, whether it's to cut the image, digitally or physically or whatever, or to intervene with the image in this way. Like I'm constantly doing something that feels. There's an interface that's gestural rather than, about necessarily the mechanics of any tool, any one tool I'm using at any given point along the practice.
I mean, let's talk about that idea of the gestural, because one of the things that another thing that Photography is Magic talks about is how you talk about photography in a post-disciplinary era, which obviously your own biographies represent what that means. And with that goes a sort of a movement away from feeling securely that we understand what we mean by photography, sculpture, and painting, and a movement which is not least prompted by the simulation of those disciplines through software, which is the photographic, the painterly, and the sculptural. So they have this kind of lack of kind of signing a contract for life of allegiance, you know, but you can still use these modalities and you can mix these modalities. And for me, like, the gestural seems very much within the painterly tradition that you're describing. And bigger than that, also the sort of very human mark-making traditions. Except they're done with digital tools, but that in a way is not really its definition, that's just its mechanics.
Right.
I mean, do you see what you're doing as having, I mean, do those terms feel comfortable for you, the painterly, the photographic, and the sculptural?
I can't say I think about them too much, but I definitely think about mark making in that way, in that sort of primal way, that it's like these are the surfaces that I'm drawn to, that I have available to me, and therefore I want to intervene in some, you know, sort of very basic way. And in that way it feels kind of like very simple.
I think that my obsession with the photographic image is because of its aura, and it's still, I mean, Benjamin's text on that, it's still relevant now, right? Like, and I think that's so fascinating that our relationship to this, even though it's changed, it actually is pretty much the same too, in terms of like the way in which photography kind of holds a certain place outside of the art context, but in general, like in our lives, in our vernacular. It's another kind of language that we all engage with, and it has power. That's fascinating to me. So I don't think I think about it purely on the formal lineage in terms of the categories in art discipline. I think about also like the cultural phenomena of the photographic image, which I still think is extremely fascinating, and it has continued obviously to produce awe. And so how that invades my interest in utilizing or misusing some aspects of photography is how to create a set of experiences that unfold in a temporal manner. And that's something that is really, I think, a part of like what brings the contemporary to the photographic kind of narrative that I just set up. Because the rapid consumption of images, like that tempo or that kind of, I don't know, to borrow like I guess a term from music, the contrapuntal, right? Like there's so much going on with the way in which we read images. Like it's funny that we're not talking about time. You know what I mean? Like we're talking about its like visual component, but there's all of these other like nuances that make it really, really a rich space.
Which is kind of like, I mean, thinking about sculpture, tactile or actualities of, I think maybe we all have that in common, the interest in not just the image, but the thing that is the image, and then how does that relate, and then like the viewer in real space looking at the image, the object, and the relationship between those kind of parlays, you know?
I mean, it brings us to the idea about the kind of relationships that you construct with your viewers, which are, as you say, Leslie, very multi-layered. I mean, possibly, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but if there's a general thrust that I saw across Photography is Magic and the artists who are selected for that, if there's a general thrust, it is about a really detailed analysis and form of production about getting the right attention, knowing that people's general visual literacy and the speed at which they look is something which is different from the experience that you want people to have with your works itself, and also that you would want to have. You don't want the relationship to be kind of stuck out of time in sort of a definition of where there's a real separation between the artist and the viewer, both in terms of production values, but also in terms of really articulation of a photographic idea. Like, I see all of you artists really thinking through what the viewer already knows. So maybe you could talk about the kind of structures that you use to set and frame the attention that you want your viewer to give.
I'm actually really glad that Leslie brought up speed, because I feel like that that is definitely part of the conversation for me personally, but also something that I see as a thread that ties in with a lot of the tactics used in a lot of the works in the book. And I think that we're all sort of reconciling ourselves with the pace of image consumption, and I think it was John Houck that said last time we talked about an attention economy that's shifting, and kind of not trying to meet the demands, but at least kind of intervene in that at the very least, or maybe augment it in some way, so that at the very least you're creating some sort of pause in that onslaught, and maybe rearranging that process for someone. In terms of my work, all I really want to do is just ask a question for a second, or intervene in a way that subverts the expected, so that space can exist for a minute.
But I think also like assumptions, maybe to try to basically, what are assumptions people bring to something, and how can you slightly skew that so that then they're looking again because it's not what they expected. Like, what are their assumptions and expectations of looking at an image or a photograph or something, and or an experience, and then the ways you can kind of maybe, like, I would say fool them like magic, but like
misdirect.
Yes, it's sort of flipping, or there you have to look again because it's not what you think it is at first glance, and that's sort of slowing down, intentional, not deception, but
and I mean that analogy is made in the book about the way that a magician often, always, mistakes or fumbles or embarrassments are actually staged to bring the magic into real time, but also to misdirect the viewer from what is actually happening. And I think that that's very much going on in not in a spiteful or kind of malicious way, but actually just in a way of getting people to that state of attention that you want. Leslie, is that something that resonates with you?
Of course. I also have a fascination with film, the moving image. And even though I didn't study film, I have a habit of like being very interested in things that I didn't necessarily study. But I think I liked the language in kind of film theory, and that I think also led me to think about pace and timing and viewership, the kind of flipping between we're all viewers, and then to also like construct an image. I became extremely fascinated with Stuart Hall and how he also problematized like thinking about the image, that we're always encoding and decoding images all of the time. And that was interesting for me to think about, like, how to make an image that allows space for that. So there's pauses. Like, how do you construct an image that has a pause? And I think sometimes it's I don't want to say misread, but sometimes my work is, there's words that are used like oblique or opaque. But I think that's this it's a guise, because I think a step further, it starts to speak, or it unfolds. So it looks one way, but it actually is doing the opposite.
Another analogy, photography is magic, my text is just full of analogies with magic. In fact, somebody kindly pointed out to me that if you changed every word from magic to photography, it still made perfect sense, which was sweet. But one of the other things that it talks about is it's about close-up magic rather than stage illusion, which is this kind of illusion is very much based on a real physical architectural separation between audience and the performer, the magician. Whereas close-up, it's really a very, very close circle. And I see that also, I also, well, maybe it's a slight fantasy on my part, but I map that onto you all as artists, that you must have your very close circle of people who are paying the same nuanced attention to all of these things. And like, I fell in love with magic when I started going to the Magic Castle, which is the Magicians Club in Los Angeles in 2007. And it's a club where really magicians are performing to other magicians. And you can tell, you know, like a nod goes round when somebody did something amazing. And I kind of get a sense, am I romanticizing it, or do you have your close circle? I mean, it seems that there's a real healthy competition and conversation, even if you don't spend any physical time with certain artists. But I sort of see this sort of relay sort of happening between you all, and I wondered if that rang a bell.
I think definitely. I mean, I'm like an avid Tumblr, and you know, if I'm not in physical contact with some of the people in this book, like it's definitely, I know them through their work, and and I'm always, you know, it's like kind of like waiting for a great album from, you know, some band that no one knows about. You're like, oh, what's so-and-so going to do next? And, you know, and then discuss it. And, you know, obviously there's some people like Letha who I'm, you know, and talking with on many levels, and that's sort of coming into the work. And then the work itself, you know, I think you and I we had talked about the lack of sort of a biographical trajectory in a lot of the work. And, you know, I think because of that, the work's able to speak for itself and to each other in a really interesting way.
Yes.
That often is sort of separate from, you know, more traditional photographic practice for whatever reason.
Yeah. I mean, at the point I had made earlier, sorry, I should clarify because nobody else apart from us were there, was sometimes I have a challenge. I mean, I've stopped teaching pretty much, but while I was teaching, I mean, because the work is it's a lot for somebody who's not coming from that tradition, or to kind of get their head around, like, what is happening here? What is this work doing? So there's that challenge, and it's difficult to know whether to read that challenge as an inclusive one or an elitist one at first glance, if you're coming from a very you know, more of, say, the documentary tradition, or, you know, a more commercial idea of what contemporary art photography looks like. And then on top of that, many of you, and this is also included in the book, that every artist wrote a statement or included an excerpt from an interview. And it's super articulate. Like, you don't need art historians to say this is why this is important. It's all there in what you say. So there's a sort of terrifyingly kind of high standard of articulation in your words, as well as these kind of very conscious ways of taking our attention and asking us to think about the way that we're looking in the image environment that we're all operating in. So it means that the idea of the biography, the idea that, you know, you could stand in front of a piece and say, oh, well, this person was thinking this and doing this, and, you know, I can feel their pain, or I can feel their kind of whatever, is absent from the work. I mean, to my mind, in a super generous way. And another thing, which is, I talk about in the book something which had not occurred to me until I started writing the text, which is the magician is really essentially an empathetic performer. You don't think of magic as, I mean, magicians are weird, but they are also empathetic. And a magician practices with a three-faceted mirror, so they're always seeing everything from the perspective of the viewer. And that, for me, felt really key to what you're doing, that you're leaving that space for that, rather than expecting the first kind of engagement with the work to be, what's the biography of this person? Who is speaking thus? And that can often be read as a sort of coldness or a detachment, or a sort of lack of that sort of romantic idea of photographers as carrying cameras like prosthetic limbs, sort of documenting, you know, their self-expressing in a sort of mechanical way. So anyway, I've rambled on, and I don't know if I asked a question, but maybe you want to respond to that. Well, I mean, knowing you, I can read the work biographically. Like, I don't think you're operating on a sort of super postmodernist level of detachment with what you're doing.
I think, I mean, I put myself in the position of the viewer as they are me or something. So in that case, as a, I do that. I'm aware of that moment because ultimately you don't know what other people want or like or anything. You can only kind of imagine, like opening it up so that other people can be in your position or you're like them. And I don't know, that's sort of a way of kind of also getting a distance to look at something that might be personal in one moment, but then you also want to imagine yourself as someone else looking in this kind of back and forth. Yeah. And I mean, that's also one thing why I like working with landscape, because to me it's sort of open. People insert themselves into the scene, or they're the viewer of those scenes, and like I've been really interested, ends up being this thing where people have their own relationships, maybe not to that place, but to some other place that it makes them think of, and how that has become kind of an open area that allows me to kind of allow the viewer to bring their own self to it, which has been really interesting.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. I mean, I think stock images function in a similar way. It's like there's an open-endedness to them. People are going to bring their own set of associations, and I hate talking about myself in general, so I'm glad to I want to talk about something else with someone, you know what I mean? So it's like, for me, it's always like, if this, then why not this, and what happens when these, come together, and what do you have, so I'm also thinking about the viewer in that way, as like, the other end of a conversation I'm trying to have about these things,
I think also that we are simultaneously multiple identities, right? That's kind of we all know this, but I think our technology also is an interesting mirror, right? To we're multitasking, we're doing all these things all the time. And I know from my work, the depth of field is very shallow, right? I'm working in a very kind of small space. Yeah. And the space I'm referring to is maybe a mental space, interiority in a certain way, right? It's something that it's I am the viewer as well. And I mean, I'm repeating myself, so I apologize. It's a very
well,
but I think it's
repeat away.
It's something that you just that description of kind of setting up those mirrors. It seems like a very kind of myopic or a very closed thing, but it actually does the opposite, which is extremely fascinating. Yeah. And so I think when I looked at the book, there's something. All of the work is extremely detailed and specific, but it's so broad and open, and it's not just the modernist abstraction that you were talking about. It still leads us there. I think when you look at the works, there are all of these formal things happening, but it's also simultaneously something very close, very specific, idiosyncratic as well.
Yeah. Amazing ladies, I think it is time, first of all, for us to have a round of applause for these amazing speakers. And for us to open up for questions. There are 2 mics. This session is being recorded, so it'd be lovely if you do have a question, if you wouldn't mind going to one of the mics. And we'll also take any questions from Twitter as well. Max. Somebody's got to be first. Well, okay. Oh, good for you. Thank you.
I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit to your editing process, as I'm sure you have, produce a lot of different images. How do you decide which ones you want to share, which ones go out into the world versus which ones stay close and need more work or go to the trash bin?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll start because mine is probably pretty straightforward. I shoot a great deal, And things that seem like they will work in concept, I mean, you know this too, I'm assuming you're an artist or a practitioner to a certain degree. And then once it becomes concrete outside of yourself, you make that decision whether or not it can connect or not. Like, you need that distance. So I shoot a great deal, I print, and then I completely have a really harsh edit. So in the end, I actually don't make a great deal of work that then becomes public, but I need to make a great deal of work in my studio that remains private, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for me, it definitely happens. I'm not very good at editing. In fact, I'll fully finish pieces and then like hate them 3 weeks later. But yeah, there is a certain amount of like detachment and trying to live with something, and I find the pieces that I live the longest with, and I'm usually that's a good standard for me to live with it myself. But I don't usually get that that luxury. So sometimes I live with it in the form of another image of it, which is then sort of an interesting process too of seeing its representation circulated and rethinking it. But yeah, editing is tough, especially when, like you said, you make so much and then only a few go out into the world. Yeah, I'm afraid I can't offer much wisdom in that regard.
I'm just thinking I think I have more of an accrual of a big library of images of the negatives I shoot, and so I don't really have to edit it. I could just kind of go through and pick them, like, today I feel like going back to 2010 and picking this thing. Or so I think when I go out and do a trip and have new negatives, new images, I'm excited to see them, and then I kind of like to use them for works. And sometimes I see the image and I get an idea, or sometimes I have an idea and then the image works out with that well. But then occasionally I'll just go back and then I have my like heavy hitters that I always return to, and like this green thing looks so good, So depending on what the piece is, I just kind of can like flip around.
I mean, I guess the photographic element, and within that, photographic editing is just one stage in the process for you. Like, it's not editing to find final form. Like, I imagine there's sort of different stages. I mean, that's kind of what you've described, Lisa.
Well, also, like, I think what's interesting about the images is it'll change, So when I first look at them, I like this, but then maybe a month later or a year later or 2 years later, I'll be like, I'd never really noticed this image.
Yeah.
And so looking at it in a different mood or day or whatever, I'll have a different relationship to the images, and then maybe I'll rediscover something, or for a particular reason.
Yeah.
Like, so it's kind of nice because it's always changing to me.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm a huge fan of all of your work, and I have a question that actually I ask myself in my own studio practice quite a bit. I wonder how long and to what extent we're attached to the word photography, when so many of the materials are actually maybe have more in common, nowadays have more in common with drawing or painting, to how long do we have to keep this word, and what does it mean, and what are the boundaries, and when have we gone beyond that, when it can become something else? And it's something that I find in the art world, in the commercial art world, and it seems like photography is always in its own little category, its own little box, and so much of this work is now cross-disciplinary, and I'm just wondering how you all handle that.
Sherry, that's such a good question. I go back and forth so often in total earnest, from wanting to associate the work with photography and then also wanting to completely eschew the term altogether. I think one thing that especially in our discussions, I've come to is that my experience of my own work is so often mitigated by, like I said, the representation of it outside of itself, or the rephotographing of it and the dissemination of it via social media and all that stuff. And that all feels inherently photographic to me. So that's sort of where I situate the photographicness of the practice, is this engagement with the larger cultural milieu that is at work in its production and dissemination.
I actually don't have a problem with the word. I think the word is really beautiful, and I wonder, now that you asked this question, now I feel like I need to go and like know the history of like exactly like why the word developed. But I think that photography, I actually embrace some aspects of the historic component of the photographic, the word photography, right? Like that it is this technology that is a stand-in for a body, right? Or stand-in for an eye. That's fascinating. That's not the same as drawing. That's not the same as painting, right? So even though I am kind of approaching it through a different discipline, I am also interested in the phenomena that is photography. I was at, sorry, that was like all of a sudden like really big, but I was at the Hasselblad Foundation and basically in August, and I was fascinated because I was looking at Victor Hasselblad's sketchbooks. And it's interesting because he wanted to be an ornithologist.
Yeah.
And it's just full of drawings of birds, of observation, and how that then the war shifted him in a way. It's just it's fascinating. I think there's something that we need as a culture to continue to grapple with technology, and photography is a perfect bridge for us to complicate our relationship to the detachment that the photographic medium produces, right? So whether or not it's like surveillance, which we didn't talk about, right? The kind of destabilization of the identity or authorship. All of these things are different in different mediums, but I think like photography kind of hits right on that edge, and it's completely fascinating. So even though I think there's aspects that we're like, oh yeah, no photographic history, but then at the same time, it's like such a rich history to engage. And
And I think also because of this strange separation of it as a realm of photography, then to me it's like, then there's all these things you can kind of, it's more material to break out of or something or butt against, or, and then I think of more of the photograph instead of photography, because I'm like really, I don't know, there's ways it could be material or immaterial, and those differences are huge differences. And then, like even like what you're saying, and then I was thinking we didn't even talk about looking, because I always think about looking and vision and light and how it reflects and like basic, magic of the world, and that's where I go to when I think of like the fact that this paper can travel, and an image that I saw, it's like that like blows my mind, So it's like this kind of like simple, almost like because I don't understand it, it's like, it's fine. But it is, something very root, there just about looking that I think can relate to any kind of painting, sculpture, anything.
Yeah. I mean, can I answer that question too? About I think the idea of photography, it's so bound up in its kind of late 20th century manifestations. So we got a bit obsessed, and our sort of focus was very strongly on this kind of plateau called contemporary art photography. And we sort of had a sort of, there was less of a healthy conversation about what that relationship was with amateur practice, what the relationship was with professional, so saw this collapse of photography as a profession. So sort of like the contemporary art bit seemed to be the most privileged definition. So I think the idea of photography was very much focused on a very market-centric and institutionally based understanding of what photography, how we define photography right now, which is sort of like the tail end of that marvelous period starting in the 70s of real cultural validation of photography. But it was done in such a way that it was all about single authorship, signature styles, the history, selecting the few from the many. So there's just so many modalities that are actually about the contemporary experience of being an artist, quite nimble artists dealing with these multiple ideas of what photography is that aren't sort of readily sort of dealt with or kind of analysed within this cultural version of photography that we got left with at the end of the 20th century. And then in light of Web 2.0, it just explodes, and it says actually the most interesting ideas about photography, the most amazing possibilities are spawned out of collective behaviours, literally the behaviour of images, unauthored practices. And that, I think, is a much more interesting environment to be a sentient looker and thinker and articulator of what photography is. Like, I think it's a better deal right now to be affiliated with photography than it was even 5 years ago. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Kate, you had a really interesting answer to the first question. I think you were talking about your work being rephotographed and then liking it more, maybe?
Maybe more or less, yeah, sometimes more,
than
sometimes
the
less,
original,
for sure.
right?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? And Letha and Leslie, do you feel the same way sometimes?
Yeah, I think that it's like the you know, I think sometimes I kind of go down a wormhole just about the peculiarity of you know, documentation anyway, and being you know, aware of all of the you know, post-production and the treatment of these images, whether they're, you know, fashion models or you know, documentation of a show. I'm always, I think I might be more dubious than most, but yeah, I think it depends on a lot of things, but I do rely on my work to function, you know, at its best in a physical space. So there's sometimes with that, you know, and also I think it's another peculiarity of the time we live in, where I can't control what filter someone puts on it on Instagram, you know, and then all of a sudden I'm like, wow, is that what it looks like? And it you know, it does to that person, and that's cool. And so you know, it's more just a process of letting go, I guess. It's probably a control thing, but yeah, probably beneficial in the end. So.
Most of my work is photographing other photographs. So then the photograph of my photograph of other photographs is like already a kind of confusing situation, which I don't mind. But I think for me, I then fall into being much more interested in the way in which my photographs are situated in a space. And that image of the work is the most crucial, because for me, then that's where it's about looking, I guess back to Letha's question, that the work is a proposition to a viewer, to have a very intimate relationship with the work. So I have fallen more so in love with seeing my work in situ, right? Seeing a photograph of it with a great deal of space, because that space is inevitably filled by a viewer, and that's kind of the importance of it.
Yeah, I do think it's a strange, I don't know. And actually we were talking about, you know, communicating with other artists or conversations, and I feel like images of work and what you see is definitely a way, and the work existing in this whole other realm. I mean, yeah. I feel more separated from, you know, I'm trying to make the object or that thing that you experience. So then when I see images of it, it's always a little, I mean, there's some works that you photograph better than others or look better. Sometimes you're like, whoa, really? You know, I mean, you always want it to look better in person. But then there's this strange thing that happens and it was reflattened, and it's like, and then you can't tell the scale, and they'll see something like, oh, I thought that was really big. And it's like a little piece like this. And they thought it was enormous, you know, but it's like, you can't tell. But then maybe there's something exciting there. I always think that it's interesting that the idea can still sort of travel through it. Like they understand it anyways, and it's a different, so that's really nice, you know.
Thank you.
Hi. I got a question for you guys. I mean, obviously we've talked a lot about sculpture and painting and the language of that coming through in the photographs, but maybe it's sort of a two-part question. But, you know, for at least two of your works that I'm familiar with, Kate and Letha, you guys, you know, sort of going against the idea of photography as a print, as an edition. A lot of what you do is unique. So they're objects. Can you just talk a little bit about that in terms of your attraction to photography, and is there something in the surface of the photograph that, you know, leads to what you're making? And more specifically, you know, Letha, you mentioned before that you go to shoot specific places. do you have the material in mind and the piece in mind as you're going out to shoot, or are you sort of, I think you had mentioned you were sort of collecting things, but more often than not, are you looking for something really specific to turn into one piece?
Well, I'll answer that first since interestingly, the way I've photographed has changed. So, you know, I really, in the beginning, when I was shooting photographs for works, I would kind of be looking for something. So I want this vista, I want this thing, I want to, you know, I don't want any cars, I don't want any whatever. And I would go out and, you know, my family lives in Colorado, so often I'll go visit them and then we'll take camping trips or go on trips together for the summer for a week or two. So I end up in these sites, and sometimes I choose them and sometimes my dad chooses them. But but it was never, I could never find that image I was looking for. It never was the right thing. Like, it wasn't the right height and the thing. And then I finally like let it go. And I think it was actually the summer I was at Skowhegan, I walked through the forest over and over and over again. And I had more time and I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. And I started taking pictures of 2 little rocks or a big tree or this. And then I realized, well, that could be a piece, or this could be something, or this could be something later. And then I just kind of basically since then changed so that when I'm out there in that situation, I just let whatever happens happen, and what I see, try to be really observant. I mean, that's where I'm the most observant, is when I'm out there hiking and shooting. Yeah. When I'm in the city, I'm just like, whatever. But those moments, to try to be very present and look and then just capture what I see. So not to have, and it kind of relieves the pressure of having to go out there and just get this perfect shot. You know, it's just kind of like whatever happens, happens. It might be a little rainy, it might be fuzzy, and kind of shoot a bunch of pictures, and I'm not even seeing it because it's on film. And then when I get back and look at it, it's like almost for the first time. And then, you know, that kind of surprise of this or that, and these like little moments you capture, and like you couldn't have planned that. So I think I try, it's another way of me like relieving the preciousness of that photograph, as you know.
I'll speak to the edition thing because editions actually really are fun for me, because I like, to me it's like another perceived constraint of like traditional photographic practice that's fun to subvert, because my work as it exists, it starts as a digital file with many layers in Photoshop, and to me it's kind of fun to play with the fact that that file can output, you know, a multitude of unique works, and the, you know, the measure of their uniqueness is simply like putting one layer in front of the other, or you know, altering the order of those layers. And so yeah, the idea of an edition is just sort of another place to play with that expectation of a certain output.
Yeah, you need to come to a mic.
Hi, thank you for this. This is really quite wonderful. My question is a follow-up, or it's related. I'm an 8x10 landscape person, and I'm feeling
with a real smile.
I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about that tonight. Went to graduate school in the late 90s, darkroom, and so in the way that my question is related, it's about the word photography, and what I'm doing versus what you're doing, and how it will be defined in the future. And what's going to happen, basically? It's a question for you specifically, Charlotte. Like, will there be 2 parallel photography tracks?
Right. You know, I'm a remarkably unsentimental person, so I don't really mark the passing of anything really that much. And I was saying actually earlier to Letha and Kate that actually it really doesn't matter to me whether we'll remember this particular grouping of artists that I am really committed to, because at this moment it is absolutely truthful to what is happening and the conversation that's happening within practice. And it matters less to me whether every single one of those is going to go on and have market value or have monographs written about them or completely change their direction so you in unrecognizable ways in a year's time, completely give up photography. Like, I don't really worry about that too much, because I think, in 100 years' time, nobody will be able to tell a difference between Andreas Gursky and Naoya Hatakeyama and, a million other people working with large format. And that's not because it's not really important right now for us to know the nuanced differences between these different attitudes, but it's just a fact, is that stops being relevant in the future. It's all about the nuance is really about this present moment and acknowledging this present moment and being part of it and being part of the conversation. And also, I just think history is very suspicious how few people beyond white men that get selected out to represent what actually came to pass.
I was going to say, when I first started printing in the darkroom again, actually, because some of my earlier photo sculpture pieces were digital, and then I actually started printing in the darkroom because it was cheaper and quicker and more immediate for me. But I was really worried that the other people in the darkroom were going to hate me because it was like what I was doing to the photograph, and I didn't want it to be read as like, and I know something like, yes, it is sort of a, come on, photograph, do something for me, but also like, I love you, love, hate, like, I love this, I want to punch it, or something. So, it's not like a disregard or disrespect for like traditional or photographs that don't bend, so that's sort of, I don't know, it's interesting for me, being peers with sculptors and painters and of the ilk, then when like suddenly like the photo people found me, I was like, oh, okay. And then they were into it. But I was like, I always thought they might hate me. I don't know, just, because it is also like exactly screw you, photography. So.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel also like a lot of my practice came from necessity and ease of accessibility of certain things over other things. I mean, I was just a bad photographer in a lot of ways, like, and I still am, and it's fine by me. And I started working this way with hopes that I could exist with 8x10 landscape photographers on the same,
right.
As part of the same conversation about what these things mean and how they function in our societies. So yeah, I think there's a place for everybody.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't understand the binary, like why there needs to be one. And I'll also just say again, like, and maybe a part of me saying that I'm not a photographer, I'm an artist, and I just feel like that feels more open to me, that I don't necessarily have to displace anyone. And I don't think that even the argument of the book is about displacement. I think it's about, I mean, Charlotte has said really beautifully what it's about, but it's taking the temperature, right? Like, that latter part of the 20th century, something happened. And I think it's so important that you talked about 9/11 and the kind of paradigm shift. So we artists are, I mean, it sounds like cliche, but artists are also sensitive to these shifts. And I think our work, that rupture created something, and we responded. And who knows how long that response will last, but I think it's just really, I think, a beautiful testament to like marking what is the role of an artist in society, right? So maybe that's, I think a more open conversation than to say like, okay, this work looks different than the history of photography or the way in which perhaps like another generation of artists, photographers were working. Yeah, that's true. But it's not about displacement, or I don't personally feel like it is.
I agree.
Hi. So this question is for anyone that wants to answer. But so all of your relationships to image and objects seem very cyclical. So images kind of cycle into objects and objects into images. Can you guys speak to that in regards to production, and then also like pre-production, your relationship to the image pre, and then during, you know, the creation of that, and then, you know, like Kate, sometimes you don't even see the object until like post-production. So, and that may be later in a space, like in a gallery or in a museum hanging, you know, where it demands the viewer's involvement in that process. So, yeah, thanks.
That's a good question too. Yeah, that's, I think, something that we forget is, like, you know, that there are so many layers, and we've all said layers. It's like to the studio practice, as well as, you know, the way it's exists in space. But yeah, for me, the image it's actually quite separate. Like, looking for the images, searching for, you know, collecting the images, and like that's a huge part of you know, not unlike your shooting and your reshooting. It's like that's like this really expansive kind of aspect of the work, and very image based, and very like I'm thinking really photographically at that point. I'm like letting images seduce me, letting them act on me, and that way. And then there's a phase of, you know, the image editing and the layering and the work in Photoshop that actually feels completely not photographic, because that space becomes entirely flattened, and it's you know, very much about the ways in which I can, you know, best use or best intervene with the technology to get what I consider like a result that's close to my instinctive gestural, you know, desire for it. So yeah, that's very non-photographic. And then going back to printing on photographic paper, or, you know, or printing using photographic output technology or whatever, like whether it's, you know, printing direct to substrate or having actual C prints mounted, that's like, then it feels photographic again. So it definitely, you know, for me, it cycles in and out of those spaces. And I interface with them really differently at each phase.
And to add to what you're saying too, and also I really love this question, actually following up on the previous question, because, or comment, that I think once I started photographing, I call them temporary sculptures, I realized that the convention of framing became a problem, because all of a sudden it felt condensed or contained. And so then I realized that it didn't stop with the shooting of the photograph. I also then had to think about the structure that holds the photograph, if I wanted one. So then I started constructing frames. And yeah, that lean, some of them lean, some of my works hang. Proportion, like all of those little details. When is there glass? When isn't there glass? Right? So those decisions were heightened after thinking about the image itself in a different way. Then it required a different structure or scaffolding after. That's a great question.
That made me think of, sometimes I think of my work like cooking. So when I go shoot these photos, it's like tilling the soil and like preparing the land and planting the seeds. And then when I go to the darkroom, it's like watering and little things growing. And then I come back to the studio, and then it's like chopping up vegetables and like.
That's really nice. Like having just a nice time.
Yeah, but it's sort of like there's all of these parts, and then they're separated by space and time and maybe a year or something, and like the things that happen in there. And then sometimes it's like, how does this paper fold? Can I make it do this? And then it's like going back to find the image, or sometimes it's the image. It's like, and this kind of back and forth and so open, and then I could work on little things, or then go to some maybe a process-based piece, like a concrete piece, which is this like process I've created over like years of playing. So that playfulness and that moment of like being able to kind of just think freely, parts, but then separate from the maybe making part, and then, you know, depending on where it is and the site and all those things. So
we've got one question here. And Max, do you have any Twitter questions that are as good as the questions that have come from the audience? Just saying. Okay, all right. Sarah.
Speaking of playing, and the cooking analogy is really a nice one. And Kate, you'd mentioned playing too. it seems like with magic, a lot of times the reaction when someone does a trick is this kind of laughing or smiling or kind of this pleasurable reaction. And I wondered how much any of you sort of, how important humor was to the making of your work and the reception of your work.
I don't think humor operates in my work. Maybe it does, but playfulness does. Maybe, okay. Yeah, sorry. But I think, you know, humor also, you can get away with a lot of things, right? It's a package, which probably magic is too. I mean, I haven't studied magic, but, nor comedy. But I think like, I preface a lot, sorry. But like, I think that it's an interesting package, right? That you could then, critique can happen in that space, right? Like there's a disarming that occurs that then other things can also arise. And so maybe that's how I could connect to thinking about humor, though I don't do it in a very conscious, perhaps it's on the subconscious level that this is operating. But no, it's a really, being a part of this and even thinking about this term magic has been completely fascinating to me because I haven't really thought about it to the extent that now we're kind of mining and digging up a little bit more. But it's a beautiful metaphor, I think, for art, right? Like, I think it does kind of serve a purpose. And, you know, magic kind of is on the periphery, like it's magic, you know, I don't know. But like, I think thinking about art in that space, it's quite amazing.
Yeah. And
Sorry. Thank you.
yeah, humor is, I wouldn't say humor so actively as like a sense of absurdity. Sometimes it's like, yeah, like a point to access maybe a different syntax for these images. So it's like, you know, an image of eggs wants to find its way towards an image of toast, but what happens if it's next to an image of like, you know, mud or, you know, something else, like you know, I don't know, like a Jeep flying through the air, someone doing yoga, like, and in that way, like allowing the viewer to make different connections between these things, and like a laugh is a nice way to get there, you know, and so yeah, it's a tactic. But I have just as much fun doing it. You know, it's like, it's for me as well, because I'm tired of being acted on the way that these images usually act in culture. I'm tired of like everywhere I go seeing the same stock image. So I want to see it do something different, and I'm hoping that someone else does too in that way.
Yeah, when you were, I was thinking absurd too, and you were thinking that too. And I think when the humor, I mean, there's definitely pieces I have that make me laugh sometimes and when I'm making them. And I think this sort of, but it almost has to arise from a moment. You know, it's not like I can't really plan for it to be funny, but like suddenly it'll be a gesture. It's almost like slapstick comedy.
Right.
Something, and then like it falls or whatever, and you know, that can be funny, or you know, but especially when it's about that. So maybe laughing at oneself or having that kind of lighthearted, also like accident-prone thing happen can be humorous in a good way.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing? Because I love that you brought up the absurdity component, because every artist in the book, I mean, I'm pretty sure, is deconstructing the photographic apparatus to a certain degree, right? And in that, there are absurdist moments, right? Like putting things that don't align together, right? And then that produces this like affect. Sorry, I'm just repeating whatever.
No, that's a good way of
really strong. I love thinking about that.
I think that's true. It's a theme throughout, for sure, a lot of the work, or at least I get that feeling looking through it. Yeah, it's surrealism. And there's like a clunky, kind of clumsy muddling through that has that effect, for sure.
And and the idea of ordinary effect, essentially, that it's a very common, it's a really deep, common, absurd language and game that's being played. And it's beautiful. I think that was such a lovely question to end our questions on. I want to thank all of you who sat through quite a long session and asked amazing questions. I'd like to thank other Photography is Magic artists who are here, Hannah Whitaker, Arthur O, and I forgot the wonderful Jason Evans, who is also here. But most of all, I want to thank Leslie, Kate, and Letha for an amazing conversation. Thank you.
Charlotte.